Hello and welcome to the Knowledge Facebook Lives. I'm Tom from the communications team. Thank you for joining me today. These are our live Q&As. We have a wide variety of knowledge at Kiel, so we decided to get some of our academics live on Facebook to answer some of your questions. And today I'm joined by Dr Mark Eccleston-Turner. Hello, Mark.
Hi there.
How are we?
I'm not too bad. Yeah, I'm good. How are you?
Good. Are you enjoying lockdown and quarantine?
It's not too bad. I'm coping okay. I'm baking a lot of bread. Got a lot of time to do that now, but yeah, it's going quite well.
Any
Thank you.
any
How's yours?
special varieties of bread? Anything interesting?
I've tried to do sourdough and it's just really not working. But I make quite a good sort of poppy seed bagel. That's what I'm. Yeah.
Lovely.
Yeah, it's
Wow.
not bad. I'll bring you some when we're around.
Yes, do. I'd love some. So, Mark, do you want to quickly sort of go over what your area of expertise is at Kiel and what it is you do?
Yeah, so I'm Dr. Mark Eccleston-Turner. I'm one of the lecturers in the School of Law at Keele University, and my research is around international law and global health, and mainly infectious diseases. So I write a lot about how the international legal community, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and governments respond to and plan for and prepare to respond and prepare and respond to infectious disease outbreaks. So that's what I typically work on. So I mainly work around pandemic influenza and lots of the preparatory stuff around that, but I also worked on Ebola in West Africa in the DRC when that occurred, and I'm doing quite a lot of work around the ongoing COVID pandemic at the moment.
So, I guess it's been a pretty interesting time for you and a pretty busy time.
Yeah, it's pretty busy. Yeah. There's a lot of things which are happening, and there is one thing that's quite interesting is so for all of my career up until now, I've typically talked about a hypothetical pandemic in the future and how governments will respond and how the World Health Organization will respond. Whereas now we're talking about that event and watching it unfold and trying to respond to that event unfolding in real time, which is a sort of added dimension we've not had before on this scale.
So, if you are watching and you have a question for Mark as we go along, please do drop it in the comments and I'll try and ask it as we go through. But, Mark, just overall, what obligations do governments have when responding to pandemics like this?
So the main international legal obligations come from the international health regulations. Now, these were passed through the World Health Organization in 2005. They came after the SARS outbreak in 2003, where the World Health Organization put in an international legal instrument, a treaty, to enable the world to better prepare for and respond to pandemics and emerging infectious disease events. Although the regulations don't just apply to natural occurring infectious diseases. They also apply to things like deliberate biological weapon attacks and those sorts of things. But broadly, the international health regulations compel member states to make sure they have systems in place which are able to prevent, protect against, control, and provide a public health response to events as defined under the international health regulations, international health emergencies. And typically we look at this in the area of pandemics. So the first obligation is that countries need to have a health system in place which is able to detect emerging infectious diseases or an emerging health emergency when they occur. So you need to have surveillance systems in place and lab capacity in place to be able to identify and detect a health emergency when it's occurring. The next major obligations that governments have is to notify the World Health Organization within 24 hours that you believe a health emergency is occurring within your territory, within your country. So you have an obligation to alert the World Health Organization, and through alerting the World Health Organization, you're alerting the wider international community to the fact that there is a potential health emergency within your territory. Now, these are called pings or notifications, and the World Health Organization receives hundreds of these over the course of a year. Some of them are localized and contained and do not spread. Others become major international events, things like Ebola in West Africa, the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, MERS, SARS. and obviously the ongoing COVID pandemic. The next obligation countries have once they notify is then if the Director General of the World Health Organization declares what's called a public health emergency of international concern. When making such a declaration, the World Health Organization typically put in place recommendations, or called temporary recommendations under the treaty, and states have a legal obligation to follow these recommendations. So they are very often around not putting in place unnecessary trade and travel restrictions, or not placing unnecessary burdens on human rights in the response to a pandemic or in the response to a health emergency. Now, very often what we see is governments actually ignoring this part of their international legal obligations. They tend to place, what we see in previous pandemics is governments are very quick to ignore temporary recommendations when WHO put them in place, and are very quick to put in place trade and travel restrictions on other countries, close borders, prevent imports, all of those sorts of things against WHO and against scientific advice. Those are the main obligations which come from the international health regulations. But pandemics aren't just about the sort of health response. Governments also have international obligations in respect of human rights during a pandemic. So under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, any restriction which a government wishes to put in place, so something like quarantining individuals or placing in place what we call a cordon sanitaire, which is a widespread quarantine of an entire place, an entire village, an entire town, an entire region. What we saw early on in this outbreak was China in using widespread cordon sanitaire in Wuhan, where they basically locked down the city and locked down the region and prevented anyone from moving in and out of it and moving within the region. If governments wish to use those sorts of measures, there are legal checks and balances which must be satisfied, which make those measures lawful or not. So it must be strictly necessary in order to achieve a legitimate aim. It must be the least intrusive and restrictive measure which is available. It must be based on scientific evidence. It can't be arbitrary or discriminatory. It must be limited in duration. You must be able to appeal and review against your detention, and it must be respectful of human dignity. And it's worth noting that just because a scientific measure works doesn't necessarily mean that it's human rights compliant. So we do have this dual conflict here of just because the scientific evidence says that a measure works from a scientific perspective doesn't necessarily mean it's lawful from a human rights perspective. So we have a trade-off here between the scientific evidence and human rights. So those are the two major obligation or streams of obligations which governments have from the international health regulations and the civil the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Now, one thing I've become interested in and have been working on for a little bit of time is around what are governments' obligations in respect of sharing viruses. Now, access to viral samples or pathogen samples during an outbreak is of extraordinary importance. So, first of all, sharing of viruses from the country or the region in which an outbreak is occurring, sharing that with the wider international community allows analysis of the virus to happen. So allows us to understand what is happening here with this virus. But it also allows the development of medical countermeasures. It allows for the development of a vaccine. It allows for the development of a pharmaceutical intervention, for example. So in order to develop a COVID vaccine, for example, during the ongoing outbreak, scientific researchers need access to the virus itself. They need physical samples of the virus in their lab. So I'm really interested in what are states' obligations in respect of sharing those viruses with the wider international community. Now, you would think and you would hope that there would be quite strong obligations on countries to share those viruses, when in reality, that's not actually the case, and the reality is quite different. So we have developed through the United Nations what is called the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol to the Convention on Biological Diversity. Now, these two treaties, or these two international agreements, state that the biological resources which are within your territory, in your country, they are your sovereign resources. You own them, and you are able to use them to extract benefits or negotiate negotiate the sharing of those viruses with the wider international community. So what that means is that countries own viruses. So if a virus emerges within your country, and you extract that virus from its natural reservoir, whether that be through a human, through taking a swab up the nose, or from an animal, because lots of viruses have animal origin, you actually own those viruses. They're yours. You control them. You own them as much as you own the oil and the coal in your ground, or the wood in your forests, and all of those sorts of things. Now, what has happened as a result of that is that viruses have become recognized, and pathogens have become recognized as sovereign resources of countries. And therefore, the wider international community can't access those viruses without permission of the host country and without negotiating an agreement with that host country. And there are very good reasons for that occurring. So the major sort of event in virus sharing around the world was the 2005 H5N1 virus sharing incident, where Indonesia refused to share its viruses with the rest of the international community because they raised concerns that we're going to give you our viruses, you are then going to develop them into vaccines and patent the vaccines and then try and sell them back to us, and we can't afford them. So you get all of the benefits of using our viruses, and then we don't get anything in return. We don't get the virus to protect our population against this very virus. So that became a major standoff in the international community, where Indonesia refused to and flipped between sharing and not sharing its viruses with the wider international community. So that is where this idea of viral sovereignty and sovereignty over pathogens within your territory really took hold in the global health space. So you don't have any formal obligations to share viruses with the wider international community. And that's one of the sort of areas where there is a hole, where there is a problem in international law around global health, because we need prompt and unfettered access to those viruses. But equally, people in developing countries whose viruses are used to develop vaccines and develop pharmaceutical countermeasures need to ensure that they can have access to those pharmaceutical countermeasures and those vaccines when they arise. And we've created this bizarre situation now through this idea of viral sovereignty, where viruses become chits to negotiate and trade on the international community, where you can negotiate benefits as a result of having a virus within your territory. And if you are a developing country and you are worried about not getting access to vaccines for these during a pandemic, you probably would withhold access to your viruses until you could negotiate a good enough agreement that you get some benefit in return. You can see that perspective and you can understand that perspective, but the problem is the international community needs access to these viruses. So we have this major gap in international law.
I was just going to say, so do you think that every country, a lot of countries are now searching for a vaccine? Are we likely to see some issues in who finds it first and then what happens from there?
Yes, that is certainly going to be a major problem here. So what has been called vaccine nationalism is one of the real worries around here, where if you are the first country to discover a vaccine, or a vaccine is discovered by a manufacturer who works within your territory, there are concerns that governments may prevent or delay export of those vaccines until they've met their own local demand. Now, this has been contributed to Trump and to the rise of populism around the world, and there may be an aspect of it of that, but we saw this happening during 2009 with H1N1. When the H1N1 pandemic was unfolding, countries who were able to manufacture flu vaccines had given assurances to the World Health Organization that they would donate vaccines to WHO to then donate on to developing countries, because the problem is developing countries cannot procure these on the open market. They either cannot afford them, or there's insufficient capacity for them to actually access the vaccine itself. So countries like the UK and France and the US and Canada and Australia, Japan, who are able to manufacture these vaccines, said, yes, we will donate some vaccine to you, WHO, and you can then distribute it to developing countries who don't have access. And we did that eventually, once we were satisfied we had enough vaccine to look after our own population. So this is not a new phenomenon, and this is not a modern phenomenon. We saw this during 2009 H1N1. States are inherently self-interested, particularly during a pandemic. The problem with that is twofold. Number one, it's poor public health. So a virus raging within developing countries is a threat to developed countries, even if they're vaccinated. If there's a reservoir of COVID anywhere in the world, it remains a threat to the global north. But number two, there is a strong moral, and more importantly, there is a strong moral claim here that just because someone happens to be born in a poor country which doesn't have access to the vaccine, that can't afford to buy the vaccine, can't develop the vaccine, doesn't mean that they have any less moral claim to benefit from the vaccine than you or I do, just because we happen to live in a highly advanced economy which is able to afford to buy these vaccines ahead of poor developed countries. Now, the problem with vaccine manufacturing is that there's very limited capacity around the world, particularly flu vaccine, and we're not quite sure which system will be used to develop a COVID vaccine yet, but there's been some talk of having to use the flu vaccine manufacturing capacity. There's a very limited global capacity. So there are very few countries around the world who actually have flu vaccine manufacturers within their territory. There's a handful of them. And number two is we have a limited capacity. We cannot make any more. It's incredibly complicated and incredibly difficult manufacturing vaccines. And it's not that you can suddenly switch over your factory. It's not like a bakery, for example. So in a bakery, one day you might make bread, the next day you might make muffins. With vaccines, you can't one day make a flu vaccine and the next day start making a vaccine for yellow fever or a vaccine for COVID, for example. It's extraordinarily complicated systems and incredibly complicated processes, which are unique just to the vaccine that you make in your one factory. So you have dedicated manufacturing capacity for a particular vaccine. And that's all you make in that factory will be that one particular vaccine, and you use processes unique to that vaccine. So it's not just that you can suddenly start making vaccines somewhere else in the next year or the next 6 months or whatever. It's much more complicated and much more difficult than that. So the countries who host manufacturing capacity who can make this vaccine have a significant advantage over countries that do not, because they control supply. And if they choose to, they can put in place export controls, they can put in place regulatory measures, they can use governmental powers to prevent those vaccines from leaving the country. So even if you have ordered vaccine and you've paid for vaccine, that contract may get cancelled because the government in which the manufacturer is based says, actually, that vaccine's not leaving the country, we're having that, we're using it. And that's one of the real worries, is that when if a COVID vaccine is developed, it is going to be in very short supply very early on and in very high demand. And then how governments react to that will be very, very telling. So we've seen resolutions recently passed through the United Nations General Assembly, and just 2 days ago, a resolution passed through the World Health Assembly talking about the fact that vaccination and immunization against COVID-19 is a public good. That is the language that member states have been using. It is a public good, and it's something that everyone needs to access. Okay, that's great. That's a good moral principle to work from. But what's lacking at the moment is a real detail and a real concrete understanding of how this vaccine will equitably be distributed around the world. How will supply be managed around the world? That's something that member states are going to have to agree on. So what we're seeing at the moment, particularly through the pledging system, which the EU set up for a COVID-19 vaccine, is governments are very, very keen to provide money to develop a vaccine, and it's raised an extraordinary amount of money for the development phase. How is this vaccine going to be rolled out? How is it going to be distributed amongst the world, around the world? How is it going to get to developing countries where it can have a huge maximum benefit? How are we going to make sure that that happens in a fair and equitable basis? The international community is using language like fair and equitable and public goods, and no one's yet defined what that means in terms of distributing and or sharing a COVID vaccine around the world. And what I'm looking for and what I'm researching at the moment is some real concrete understanding of how governments around the world think that they are going, and what real solid commitments are they willing to put in place to commit to fair and equitable distribution around the world.
It's a very complicated setup. So what part in all this does the World Health Organization have?
In distribution of vaccines?
I think yes, but also in terms of just responding to pandemics. I think you mentioned it earlier, in that people report the pandemics to them, but what then happens from World Health Organization's point of view? How do they try and control this with the member states?
Okay, so the WHO is the coordinating authority in the United Nations system on international health. So what that means is they coordinate the response. But WHO is typically, during a pandemic, not a boots on the ground sort of organization. It is an organization which provides standards and best practice and scientific evidence and guidance and technical advice and technical summaries to member states. So that is its main function here, is helping to coordinate the international response in the international system, sending out the alert, sending out evidence and best practice, and being a forum. One of the really important roles that WHO has in this is being a forum for the international community to come together and work on this issue and discuss this issue together. And that role as some people dismiss international organizations as a talking shop, as they don't achieve enough, there's not enough real concrete action. You could argue that that's a legitimate response, and this phrase gets used a lot of it's just a talking shop, and I don't think we should underestimate how important a talking shop is. I don't think we should underestimate how important it is to have member states come together once a year at the World Health Assembly to discuss these issues and to make commitments to each other on these issues. That's incredibly important. Because otherwise, you then go back to isolationary politics, or you go back to states operating in isolation and not collaborating with each other. And what we see when responding to global events like this is collaboration is key, and collaboration is imperative to bring these sorts of events under control.
And so we're obviously nowhere near finished with this pandemic, and it's probably going to go on for a number of months, if not years, and we may never actually see an end to COVID-19. But what have we learned so far, and what can we now apply to our response systems and how we now treat pandemics? What have we already learned?
I think one of the things that we have to do, both at the domestic level within the UK, but also at the international level, is make sure that we take COVID-19 as a lessons learned, and one thing that the international community is very worried about is the threat of re-emerging and emerging infectious diseases. There are concerns that events like this, through climate change and through the human-animal interface, which we see, because lots of emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic in nature, they originate in animals. One thing that we're worried about is events like this could become more and more common and more frequent. And one thing we've got to ensure is that we learn the lessons of COVID-19, and we ensure that health systems are properly strengthened around the world. So I mentioned earlier that one of the core obligations under the international health regulations is that member states must have a health system in place that is able to properly detect and respond to health emergencies when they occur. One thing we know through the joint evaluation exercise, which is undertaken through the international health regulations, that's when teams of experts go into countries and assess the health system's readiness for a health emergency. We know that the vast majority of countries around the world are not prepared for a pandemic. They have not met what are called the core capacities under the IHR. we need to address that. And many of them haven't met, they haven't, it's not that they can't be bothered to meet the core capacities, it's that they lack the infrastructure and the resources and the finance to bring their health system up to scratch, if to a standard that the IHR demands of them. We need to recognize that we have an obligation to strengthen those health systems, to protect those individuals, and to improve the quality of life and to improve the health in those and development of those countries, and to ensure that events like this, if and when they occur again, can be better responded to. But one thing we've seen is that countries that are ranked very highly on the JEE, countries like the United Kingdom, countries like the US, have also responded incredibly badly. And that's not due to health system strength, and that's not due to the strength of their health system. That's due to a lack of preparedness. And it's very clear when you read Operation Signet, the pandemic simulation, which was done in the UK in 2016. It's very clear that these issues were raised quite a long time ago about the fact that inadequate PPE, inadequate systems in place, these sorts of things, and they've not been addressed. And they've not been addressed because other priorities took over for government, and the threat of a pandemic was always something which would occur at some point in the future, and we need to address this thing right now. We'll get on to pandemic preparedness because a pandemic, if and when it occurs, will occur in the future. Well, hopefully this is the wake-up call that the international community and domestic politics needs, that actually these aren't just hypothetical events, that when the people like myself who've been researching this area for a very long time, and also hundreds of other researchers going back for the last 30 years have been warning we need to prepare better for a pandemic. This will happen. This is occurring. This should hopefully be the wake-up call to governments that those warnings should be taken a lot more seriously, and that we need to improve and we need to properly build capacity and build preparedness to respond to pandemics in the future.
Mark, really, really, really fascinating. I could talk all day on this. It's an absolute rabbit hole. You can just go down so many routes, and there are so many fascinating things to learn from history, and also just from this. It's, none of us have lived through anything like this, really. So yeah, really fascinating. Thank you very much for that. We'll leave it there. Thank you to all those watching. Thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.